my end. All right, so we'll continue. All righty, so welcome to the public forum on the past and future of Black politics and the left, hosted by Platypus. I am your moderator today, Seth Davis. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, 1920s and 30s, new left, 1960s and 70s, and post-political left, 1980s and 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities or find a chapter local to you by visiting our website, platypus1917.org. This summer, we are running reading groups on Theodore Adorno's Negative Dialectics, on Hegel and Marxism, and relevant to this panel, a syllabus on the Black question and the left from 1776 to Black Lives Matter. We will post links to these in the chat. Now, I want to say a bit about why we do what we do. When Platypus formed in 2006 as a reading group between students and faculty in Chicago, those original students were heavily involved in the anti-war protests and the immigration rights demonstrations. At these demonstrations, our students encountered veteran organizers from the new left generation. The old 60s and 70s radicals insisted on one thing, that the next generation learn from their mistakes. These new leftists kept insisting that the same stumbling blocks and obstacles be acknowledged and overcome by the young people new to the left in the 21st century. Platypus took this atmosphere of critical self-examination as its reasons for being. Today, Platypus meets a lot of young people. They are disenchanted with the existing status quo and they know something is wrong, but they are not exactly sure what is wrong and they want to work through their thinking. They're looking for a group that encourages questioning of thought taboos on the left and that takes nothing for granted. If this description matches you, then please be in touch. This is why we invite the left to campus, in the spirit of learning from the past to help students experience the present. Platypus does not host panels to hear positions that we agree with. In fact, we hope for some productive disagreement among speakers. We encourage the audience to pay attention and to ask thoughtful questions. There is something to learn from a Platypus panel that is more than the sum of its parts. With this in mind, I will read the panel description that we circulated to our panelists, and then I will introduce our speakers. Beneath a consensus of avowed anti-racism, the American left remains conflicted about whether and how to politicize race. The summer of 2020 featured prodigious unrest relating to issues of racism, resulting in the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and a mainstream conversation about reparations. At the same time, however, the 2020 US election witnessed a demographic swing in voting constituencies, with Donald Trump receiving the most Black votes for any Republican since 1960. Our present post-political moment within the crisis of neoliberalism has been shaped by key antecedent periods of political conflict over race and racism, from the failure of the post-Civil War Reconstruction Era through the entrenchment of Jim Crow, through the abolition of legal racial segregation with the Civil Rights Movement, but it seems unclear what lessons should be learned from these experiences. The panel seeks to shed historical light on today's political impasse by asking, what is the state of the contemporary left regarding the Black question? If the problem of racism has been bypassed but not overcome, leaving in place the structural conditions that have shaped racism historically, then how might we recognize these structural conditions and thereby render race and racism politically tractable? How could the politics of anti-racism advance the struggle for socialism and the pursuit of freedom? Pascal Robert is an independent writer on politics and law. He co-hosts the podcast This is Revolution with Jason Miles. Robert is also the co-founder of the Haitian Bloggers Caucus and has written for Black Agenda Report, Huffington Post, and many other outlets. Ashanti Alston is a revolutionary anarchist. He is currently on the steering committee of the National Jericho Movement to Free U.S. Political Prisoners, a project inspired by the 12 years Alston spent in prison developing more radical abolitionist politics. He is a former member of the Black Panther Party and of the Black Liberation Army. Rutledge Dennis is a professor of sociology at George Mason University and a W.E.B. Du Bois scholar whose writings focus on the sociology of race, class, and culture, the sociology of Black intellectuals, and racial and urban politics. He was the first coordinator of the African American Studies program at Virginia Commonwealth University and is a former member of the Students for a Democratic Society. Ralph Leonard, our fourth speaker, unfortunately had to cancel on account of a family emergency. We wish him well. We have also encouraged him to publish his remarks as a response to this panel and the Platypus Review. So each of you will have up to 10 minutes for opening remarks, followed by up to 3 minutes for responses. where I will invite panelists to ask each other questions and to express what they agree or disagree with. I will signal you when your time is nearing its end. I might unmute myself and say you have 2 minutes left during your speaking. After the first 2 rounds, the floor will be open to the audience for Q&A. If an audience member wishes to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will unmute you, or leave your question in the Q&A box. I will only call on questions. If you in the audience have more of a comment, then I encourage you to work it into a short piece of writing and submit it to our international open submission journal, the Platypus Review. We will conclude the event promptly within 2 hours, and it will be followed by a post-panel discussion with a link to that available shortly. Panelists, today I'm your moderator and acupuncturist. I will poke and prod you on occasion if I think you say something interesting and when the audience should hear more. So let's begin. So we will start with Pascal Robert.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Platypus constituency for putting together this panel. I'd like to say greetings to my esteemed panelists, to the elders on the panel who are veterans of the 60s Black liberation movement and the intellectuals who wrote it. I give you greetings and thank you for your work and sacrifice for getting us to this point, and you all tried the best you did. I think for me, the best and the first place to start is to ask the question, why is it important for Black America or a Black American to develop left politics? And what do left politics mean? From my vantage, left politics do not mean liberal politics, because the Hegelian notion of liberal democracy does not challenge the functional fulcrum, what requires the subjugation of Black people in the overall political economy of liberal democratic societies. And what that basic fulcrum is that Blackness in a capitalist order, or even in sometimes a social democratic order, must be rendered to the reserve army of labor disproportionately, with all the social ills that come along with that, in order to create the illusion in the minds of the white majority that capitalism only fails Black people, even though more of the reserve army of labor is actually white. Now, this is something for all of us who studied Marx, who are Black Marxists or even white Marxists. This is not a new understanding. We've heard this many times before. But the actual ideological ramifications of this reality oftentimes becomes escaped upon not only liberals and the left, but those of us who claim to be Marxists at various times and iterations in history, because we become obscure to that and we say things like racism is important to capitalism because it divides the working class. Does racism divide the working class? Yes, but that's not what makes racism important to capitalism. What makes racism important to capitalism is that capitalism demands, as we know, as even the reactionary capitalist Milton Friedman said, the natural rate of unemployment. Capitalism requires a fixed unemployment rate to stop inflation, to maintain its economic functionality, whatever that rate is. Because that is the case, and because the notion of whites being the majority of those deemed poor would cause rebellion that the state and capital could not understand, we then understand and realize the necessity of capitalism rendering those who at one time were capital, which are Black people, to disproportionately the reserve army of labor, or what the reactionary capitalist Milton Friedman would call the national rate of unemployment. What does the consequence of that mean for Black America? The consequence of that means that since the reserve army of labor is relegated to be socially ostracized and housed and placed in prison for the main function of not being able to rebel and destabilize society, we understand where really economically rooted policies like mass incarceration come in. We understand why the social dislocation of deindustrialization, i.e. breaking up of families, wealth, wage inequality affects Blacks disproportionately, because in a capitalist society, particularly in America, the ultimate result of this necessity of rendering blacks to the reserve army of labor is that blackness becomes a metaphor for poverty, even though the top 10% of black families own 75% of black wealth. So the conundrum that becomes in terms of what this has meant for the left is that at one time in history, and various iterations, probably since the populist movement in the 1880s, going into the 20th century with the socialists who dealt with this somewhat, but they had their own racial chauvinism, but probably the most effective manifestation of a white left who understood these realities were the communists of the 30s and 20s, 30s and 40s period. I would suggest everyone read The Cry Was Unity by Mark Solomon, African Americans and Communists, 1916 to 1936, which talks about a period in time in America where the actual white working class communists and even white intellectual communists based the necessity of the functioning of abolishing capitalism on not only Black liberation from racism, but the working class joint struggle of Black and white working class and poor people to come together to challenge capitalism and provide a socialist, if not communist, alternative to that egregious economic order. Those types of politics had existed in America, definitely at least since the populist movement of the 1880s, where we can go back to Bacon's Rebellion in the 1600s, which again was a cross-racial alliance to try to challenge the economic order, which is what Theodore Allen calls the origins of whiteness in America. It was the first time the notion of whiteness was implemented and actually written down was as a result of Bacon's Rebellion. So the notion that working class and poor Blacks and whites working together to challenge capitalism or American colonial capitalism is something that even predates the founding of this republic. So with all of this history being said, from Bacon's Rebellion to the populist era, to the abolitionists, to the socialists and communists, then we have to ask the question, well, what exactly happened? And why did not only the notion of challenging the material conditions of American society and ruling politics and political economy evaporate from the consciousness of the white liberals or the white left? Well, even more dangerously so, what made that consciousness evaporate from the memories of Black Americans? The obvious answer to the initial conundrum comes to one simple thing: the McCarthy era and the rise of anti-communism in the United States, and the particular time in which it arises. Understanding that the agenda of the communists and the socialists from the teens, 20s, and 30s and 40s was to root the condition of the majority of Black people who were poor and working class in political economy, and realizing that the problem with American racism is that it's necessary to racially stigmatize all Black people as poor, then the best way to address racism is to stop having Black people rendered as poor and give them a material quality of life and economic stability that allows them to actually function in a way that they are no more or less poor than anyone else, which is Marx's concept of universalizing history. But again, when the McCarthy era came, and basically even being deemed a communist or a socialist could have you arrested, could have you deported, could have you all kinds of things, it became obscured in the minds intentionally and flushed down the toilet of the activists of those periods to even mention or deem possible to call themselves communists or socialists, to the point where you had stalwarts of the civil rights movement like Ella Baker, who herself was a member of a dissident communist movement in her youth, become literally agents of the state to dime out Black communists for the state to protect the sanctity of the civil rights movement. And this is covered in the biography of Ella Baker done by Barbara Ransby. This was also done by legal icon Thurgood Marshall as well. We have known this.
1 minute left. Sorry, Pascal.
So the point that I want to get to is that even though the Cold War was used as a primary rationality for having the Civil Rights Acts passed because of America's foreign policy image as a Jim Crow state, apartheid state, was bad for business, the consequence of having those laws passed without rooting the problems of Black people in political economy led to the condition we have today. We have liberal anti-racism divorced from political economy, which is the kind of politics that we need, is that Black politics and left politics, it doesn't have to be Black politics, rooted in understanding that capitalism is racialized to the purpose of rendering Blacks to redundant surplus labor, and it has to be fought on those terms to change the society for everyone who is suffering under capitalism.
Great, thank you, Pascal. And next we'll have Ashanti Alston.
Tell him he's muted. He's muted.
You're muted, Ashanti. I'm sorry.
Okay, am I good now? Woo.
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. First, just apologize for I let time get away from me a little bit. I had the kids out to the zoo, which is right across from where I live, and I figured I had an hour and be back, but time got way ahead, so I rushed back. I'm just thankful that you invited me, and I'm glad to be on with my esteemed comrades who I'm just meeting for the first time. And also, you just asking me to respond to the questions from an anarchist perspective. I appreciate that with Marxists, you know, and I come out of a Marxist school. I'm gonna get my dog out the room. Hold on. So please let me know about the 10 minutes, because the conversations is always more important. And apologize for that too. That's my little dog. So just real general, I come out of, as you said, the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, prisoner of war. And all of this, I think, is important to the conversation. I feel like from the 1960 rebellions was my entry into radical politics or radical movements. And at the time, for me, it was the Black Power movement. And what we understood of the Black Power movement at that time is that being here in this empire, 400 years through slavery, Jim Crow, everything else, that we had to fight for a revolution. And that revolution had to, as a vital part of it, that revolution had to have our interests and our perspective incorporated in it, which, you know, being people of African descent, we not only want ends of all kinds of oppressions, but particularly we want to control our community. We want that kind of self-determination. Voices of Huey P. Newton, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Eldridge Cleaver were vital. And then once joining that Black Panther Party, being exposed to a different way to look at Marxism as a tool in our liberation struggle. So not only did we had to read Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, but we had to read W.E.B. Du Bois, we had to read Robert Williams, we had to read Frantz Fanon, you know, and then once you hooked on them, you'll find yourself wanting to learn more about other struggles that incorporated a Marxist, Marxist-Leninist, or even a Trotskyist perspective. What I got out of them was the importance of a class analysis, number one. When I was able to finally get through, and I really struggled with not only Das Kapital, but Communist Manifesto, going through the dictionary for the terms and really understanding what this capitalism was, it was some heady stuff to see that this racism thing that you're fighting had more to it, you know? And so if you're going to dismantle one, it's interconnected with another. So this revolution was not just about self-determination in our, what we call Black colonies, which brought in an anti-colonial perspective, but that we had to get to the roots of how this empire got formed. So as one who's an anarchist now, and I went from, you know, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Kim Il-sung, and other folks to an anarchist, I feel like it was the way that I had to go, but I'm not one to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because to this day, what I learned about the importance of a class analysis, dialectical materialism, and historical materialism is still vital to me today. I cannot look at any situation without using those perspectives to break down what's going on and then seeing how that can help in furthering us along this liberation path. But two things that today that I bring up when I do get a chance to talk or be on panels or being interviewed is that for me, you can't deal with any of them perspectives, any of them isms, without recognizing at all times how this empire came about. Some of the more liberation theologians, they will speak of the two original sins and the foundation of what became America and what became the empire. The damn near total extermination of First Nations people, which we say Native Americans and indigenous, and the enslavement of African people. Those two things factored all through the history and ongoing story of this empire. And so for me to deal with others of different perspectives, I want recognition of the importance of those original sins, because they still play a significant, if not leading factor in trying to determine where do we go from here, not only in developing a Black politics, but for anybody of different communities, of different races, ethnic groups, to get to the root of how this empire came about. So in my life, I'm 67. I feel like I've been doing this since 1967, 66, 67. I want to know that those who I have possibilities of relating to, organizing with, coalitions, whatever, can we be on some page that we can agree on how this nation came about? There would be no understanding of Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff if we didn't see that the same people who was brought in the bottom of slave ships are still the people who are on the bottom of this society. My wife is a abolitionist. Her department is criminology and social justice. And some of the classes that she do, she connects things like the handcuffs to the same type of metal tools that they used to capture Africans on the continent. She traces things like the prison industrial complex to those structures, those castles, those structures on the west, all along the west coast of Africa that captured, held Africans until the slave ship came.
2 minutes left, Ashanti, just let you know.
Thank you. She makes them same connections. So for me today, as an abolitionist, as an anarchist, and as an ally to all the folks who are struggling to bring this empire down, it's not just a class analysis we have to deal with. In some ways, it's not even just a race analysis. What is the anti-colonial analysis? What is the anti-imperialist analysis that will not ignore the fact for me that this empire has to go, and I'll end it there. The empire has to go. It cannot be reformed. And I know that I have that same type of vision, even with those who are of different ideologies than me. So I really am honored to be on this panel.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. And next we have Rutledge Dennis.
Yes, do I unmute or mute?
You're good. We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. As a graduate student at Washington State University and a member of SDS, we all became well-grounded in Marxist literature. And we argued and debated Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Plekhanov and all the others. And it made sense because we wanted to bring theory to life, because Marxism made sense to us. The key is, how do you apply those theories to the real world? And for many of us, and for me particularly, the real world was Black America. And radical politics and revolutionary politics suggested a drastic transformation of the society, of Black society and white society. I was concerned with more Black society, and that's why, in a way, I experimented politically. I joined briefly the Socialist Workers' Party, and I was a member, not a member, but worked with one of the most radical Marxist group, the Progressive Labor Party. So I was searching, in a way, searching for a home, but I was still a student. And when I attended the anti-fascist conference in California, and Bobby Seale was the speaker, and he really cursed us out, those of us in graduate student. He said, what the F are you doing in school while the people needed you in the streets? And we felt very guilty. We could have, I want to crawl under my seat at the time he said that. But it was a lesson for us. It was a lesson for me in terms of, how do I define myself as, in a way, a radical professor or radical student in the midst of things happening in the streets? And that is, how can I use Marxist-Leninism? Now, that was my first question. The second question for me, as I moved into being a Du Bois scholar, was, how can I use Du Bois? Now, Du Bois was not always a Marxist. And his early dealings with the Socialist Party in 1906, 1911, was very unpleasant, so that even though he voted with the party, he later rejected the party because the party would not allow him to focus on those uniquely Black issues that he saw relevant. So the relationship between Black politics, Black radical politics, and white radical politics has been a very uneasy relationship, because Black politics, beginning with, we can say, David Walker's appeal, and we can say Frederick Douglass's entrance into the movement. In both cases, with Du Bois and Douglass, there were conflicts with white abolitionists and white socialists, because white socialists and white radicals always wanted to direct the ship. And that was a major problem for many Blacks. And the key, when we look at the evolution of Black radical thought or white radical thought, what we see is that white radical movements have, in a way, directed themselves into assisting Black radical movements because the Black issue was paramount in the society. That was the major issue. beginning with the abolitionist movement, and at the end of the Reconstruction with Jim Crow laws and a host of other issues that Blacks sought to fight against, so that white radicals understandably saw their mission in a way as assisting those Blacks with those issues. The problem, as we look at the evolution of radical movements, is that I think neither defined its role in their respective communities. I don't think that the white radical movement, with the exception of the labor movement, that was a well-defined mission. But I think outside of that, I think the white radical movement has been derelict and really getting into the white community and explaining what the radical movement should be. In the same sense, the Black radical movement, and this was the consternation of Du Bois at some point, never really borrowed into the Black community. And this is why the NAACP has been successful, non-successful, you see, because the problem, and we see this more in the 60s and 70s, when Black radical movements begin to become organized, we can take the Panther Party, we can take SNCC. What happens is immediately they form alliances with white radical movements. The Panthers quickly became a part of the white radical movement. And they began to de-emphasize what they initially started to do. Their initial responsibility was with the Black community, with the issues in the Black community. But as soon as they formed an alliance with the white radical movement, they moved immediately into Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, Castroism, and therefore many Blacks believed that they had deserted the cause. You see, and this is also true for the Black radical movement, like SNCC and CORE, more SNCC than CORE. SNCC immediately formed an alliance at one point with the Black Panther Party. And it also moved into the Marxist-Leninist mold. My question here is that the Black community was not ready for Marxist-Leninism. We can read Mao, we can read Marx, and what they say is you can't be too far ahead of the population you're trying to address. You have to take your roots. Your roots have to grow. And I think Gramsci said that too.
2 minutes left, Professor.
Your roots have to emanate from the people you're trying to address. So I think that both the white community, and I understand, but the white radical movement in the 1960s wanted to assist Blacks with the civil rights movement, which is a good cause. But as Blacks moved into Black power, Blacks then had no way for whites to be of assistance, because the Black power movement suggested Blacks wanted to be in charge and wanted to do things for the Black community. So I think that for a viable Black radical movement and white radical movement to survive and exist, each has to be more mindful of the community they're trying to address. I think there is enough Black thought in Douglass and Du Bois that they don't have to go to Marx and Lenin. So I think Marx and Lenin are very important to some extent, but that can't be the be-all. We have to appeal to our people in the people who they know have been the root of trying to address their problems. And it hasn't been Marx or Lenin or Engels, it has been Du Bois and Douglas.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Dennis. And so now we will go into the response portion. Each of you will have 3 minutes to respond to anything in everyone's opening remarks that you would like to address. So we will go in order again. So we will start with Pascal Robert.
Yeah, I'd like to address some of the comments. I'd like, first of all, Brother Ashanti Alston, I just want to let you know that as a writer for Black Agenda Report, as someone who's, I know Daruba bin Wahab quite well, Bruce Dixon, who was my mentor, who was a former member of the Chicago Black Panther Parties. I'm, I got my political education from people who came out of that era. I don't know if you gentlemen are familiar with my writings at Black Agenda Report. I've been writing with them for over a decade. But I, as a result of my engagement with Bruce Dixon, I started to closely analyze the utility of Black politics, and this is going to be controversial for many of you. And those who know me, and I'm going to say a name that is controversial for many on the left or liberals, know that I'm a big acolyte of the work of Adolph Reed Jr. And one of the things that I started to come to understand is that Black politics in the American context is a politics of containment. And it always has been a politics of containment. Because what Black politics has traditionally mean, and I'm not talking about the radical politics of either the Black Panther Party or the Black Communists and Socialists or the Colored Farmers Alliance, but I'm talking about the Black politics that interfaces with the ruling class to determine the policies and prerogatives of the state that will be implemented in the lives of Black and brown people. I'm talking about the establishment of the Black political class. Now, some would argue that the Black political class is a phenomenon that comes about after the Civil Rights Movement, the Gary conferences, the Gary, Indiana conferences. We know about the Black political conventions, that basically these people were beneficiaries of working in the War on Poverty administration and basically took that political education and their class pedigree and became the leaders of the quote unquote Black community. And in exchange, we got a bunch of bureaucrats trying to create an ethnic patronage politics in blackface. I actually argue that the Black political class phenomenon goes back to the Civil War, to those small cadre of Black pastors and ministers that were being negotiated with to determine, well, what do you people want after the Civil War? I would argue that the problem of Black misleadership is not that we have Black misleaders, but the fact that we need to believe that we need quote unquote Black leaders per se, as opposed to what I believe was the best model, which is the Ella Baker model. We don't need leaders. We need to teach people how to lead themselves. And we give them the political education. Speaking truth to power is a waste of time. Power already knows the truth. And that's why they're in power, because they hide it. Speaking truth to the powerless is actually what is impactful.
Yeah.
So my ultimate conclusion is to say that Black politics doesn't work for Black people because it's contained in a way in which you believe that the problem is your skin, but the problem is that your skin needs to be discriminated against to protect the function of capitalism. So as much as I love Du Bois and Douglas and so on and so forth, I love Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and all those, it's not an accident that Martin Luther King talks all these years about racism, racism, racism. He talks about capitalism for less than a year, bang, he gets killed. Malcolm X, for all these years, talks about racism, racism, racism. He starts to talk about capitalism, bang, he gets killed. How many Black people realize that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were not assassinated until they tied the condition of Black people in America to the function of American capitalism? That's a fact. So for me, I'm not interested in Black politics or white politics. I'm interested in effective politics that changes the condition of poor and working class people. And since Black people are disproportionately poor and working class, any politics that improves the condition of poor and working class people will improve the condition of disproportionately large numbers of Black people. And the elite cadre of petite bourgeois, Black professional managerial class Negroes who have governed the affairs of Black people for over a century are the cancer and the problem, not the solution, and they will never be.
Awesome. Thank you, Pascal. We will go on to Ashanti for your responses.
My goodness. I appreciate the comments from my two comrades. I'm just like, I'm floored. So I think what I want to get into is some of the things I think that from what I've heard about the Black Panther Party, Black politics, things like that, just to maybe a few comments on there. I feel from my experience in the Black Panther Party that when we were exposed to the revolutionary ideologies, the Marxisms, the Marxism-Leninisms, and even some of the Trotskyist organizations, it opened, regardless of what we thought about it, it was door openers for many of us to learn the different ways to look at a people's situation. One of the things that I learned in the Black Panther Party was that when the alliances with white movement folks happened, a lot of it was based on, I think mainly coming from Eldridge Cleaver, that's where the resources were. You know, so at the time that Eldridge was running for president and stuff, it was like, okay, we need to hook up with these white leftists, white progressive folks, because they got monies. Put Eldridge on that presidential ticket. But then I think that also the Black Panther Party was just open to working with different people, regardless, who were showing some kind of commitment to struggling against capitalism and racism. You know, that was big for me. So even when my brother, spoke about, the Castroism and stuff, when we started to learn about the Cuban Revolution, that was good stuff for us. When we started to learn about the Korean struggle with Kim Il-sung, the concept of Juche was really important for us because it meant that we had to rely on ourselves, Juche, that was really, really important. But I do agree with the brother that, it affected us in other ways too, because we're making all these alliances instead of concentrating on deepening our building within the Black community through the survival programs, through the newspaper, through being out there in the streets, in the neighborhoods, kicking it with people around revolutionary politics as far as it affected folks of color. But it meant a lot for folks of color to start seeing white folks, Puerto Rican folks, Chicano folks, poor white folks from the Appalachian Mountains and others working with the Black Panther Party. That was really some heady and heavy stuff. But we made mistakes. There's always mistakes. But I think that one of the things I want to point out was the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, which was that effort to bring all these different forces together to kind of work out a vision where we saw ourselves differently in this empire, and what it might look like if we could get rid of this empire. And it had its faults, but it's just the effort, and there's studies, there's writings now on that where people analyze, and I think they're good. There's also the Rainbow Coalition with Fred Hampton and others in Chicago. I think the efforts was good because it was helping people from different experiences under this empire to see how we could move in some kind of common direction to bring this down. The last thing was around the establishment of Black political class, you know, and that containment thing, that has been it. That is the thing I feel like holds us back so much today, even with Black Lives Matter, falling right into that. But we kind of look at it, I'm telling you about my comrades, a lot of us who went through the Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, we saw the defeat of our movements as laying the groundwork for that establishment of a Black political class. We felt like our failure, our defeat led to that. And that's what we got today. When you see he's on the news now, and he's from out of New York.
Al Sharpton?
Al Sharpton, right? He is typical of that kind of person that can even get up and sound like he's militant, but yet he is so entrenched in the politics of containment. And every time there's an issue, they will dig up him. Well, you don't have to dig him up anymore because he has got his hustler spot. But they will dig up Martin Luther King's children in a second. Find them wherever, get there, put them statements in, get all them other people that's now in Congress to help the containment process stay firm. They don't want to hear that stuff about defunding. They don't want to hear that stuff about abolition. Get them other voices in there, contain that. And what it does, it pushes us back further and further and further. The election of Barack Obama just swooped us back so far, you couldn't even see us anymore. So our voices, those type of radical voices, you know, was silenced even more. You couldn't hear us before. And the only way out of that is to figure out ways to not only get our voice back up in there, but to get that kind of grassroots organizing back in there, because I don't see that today. You got to be in the community. There's been so much reliance on the social media with the high technology of this country that people will just not go out there and do face-to-face. My anarchism is face-to-face, you know? Keep it on the ground level, figure out ways that you can involve more people in the decision makings, you know? We'll figure it out as we go, as the Zapatistas say. We don't have to have all the answers, you know? But we all are needed. I'm gonna end it with that. We're all needed. There's a critique of the academics, but I do think that the academics are important. As long as the academics do not feel that their access to information is what should make them the leaders. You know, the leaders should still be grassroots folks. What you got from the academia should help us to understand the intricacies, I was gonna say interpenetrations coming from them days of dialectical materialism, but it's true. You know, the interconnections. We need to see it because it gives us a clearer picture of the monster we face, and we can maybe make better decisions how not to fall into some of the same things. You know, so being on here now, and when people are raising stuff, I'm like, oh my God, I never thought of that. I got to stay open. And then we got to figure out how can we make this kind of conversation part of what goes on in the communities, in the streets. It's going on in the prisons, I can tell you, but they're so locked down. You know, we have to figure out how to make our politics more visible. And I say all that, and I would be remiss not to say that when we do not attend to the issue of what happened to First Nations people, and we do not attend to what happened to African people being enslaved, then we will keep our language in working class language, democratic language, and things like that. I think that when we can keep it in that language, we're also helping to confine our understanding of the issues. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. We'll go on to Rutledge.
The problem for me, leaving graduate school with my head full of Marx and Lenin and Du Bois, is what do I do with this information? How can I deal with, how can I use Marx and Lenin and Du Bois as I take my first academic position at Virginia Commonwealth University? And it was a problem for me because it was a transformation from a theoretical model or theoretical models of how to be an activist while not having a position. And what does activism mean when you're an assistant professor of sociology and African-American studies? And I found that you could do something. You could establish, as I did, the African-American Studies program at Virginia Commonwealth University. You could create some radical courses that I did and taught, Black political thought, or the sociology of the Black family, or Black economics. There are things you can do. Besides that, I became a community, not so much activist, but one who was involved in housing. I became a commissioner of Richmond Housing and Redevelopment Authority. I worked with the drug programs in Richmond. I worked with the media incorporated. We're trying to put the radio stations at task for not announcing and having many Black-oriented programs on TV. So I think there are many things you can do. But again, my point that I made earlier is where are the people and where are you? And what's the best way of getting to them? What's the most effective way? And many times, if you read Marx and Lenin and other Marxists, many of them have an evolutionary process of getting to communism. Now there is the radical Leninist process of the vanguard party staging a revolution, but there's the other alternative that people like Rosa Luxemburg talked about. That is, how do you use the people in a mass movement to rally them against the powers that be? And being a member of a university is a unique position in terms of how do you put into action all those radical thoughts, all those radical thinkers juggling around in your mind, and how can they be of use to you academically in the classroom? That was a challenge to me. And I'm, in a way, I'm still dealing with that as I am now at George Mason University in Fairfax County. And I do think it is possible. It is possible to be engaged in radical thought. I think it was a radical thought trying to bring more faculty of color into the university, just as it was a radical thought to create a Black Studies program, both at Virginia Commonwealth and again at George Mason University. So I think there are many things we can do. It is not just street activity. We are needed in the institutional network of furthering change. Now that becomes more difficult because many times people will see you in academia and immediately think that you are a sellout, that just working there makes you a sellout. And I think we need to change that by demonstrating that there are many things, radical things sometimes, that can be done if you're a part of a university and thinking in radical ways. You're not going to have a revolution in the institution, but you certainly can effect change. And I think this is important, effecting change for the good of the population. It may not be radical change at first, but change in the good direction is good for the population. And I think we need to address ourselves on those issues of the many dimensions of radical change. Some of the radical changes are spontaneous and large, but even small radical changes are important to the people who need it. And that we are the ones who are trying to address those issues, we may have to begin small and maybe see these changes as evolutionary and not necessarily all the time revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we'll start with the Q&A section, and I'll start. Feel free to raise your hand during, at the icon at the bottom if you have a question. I'll start with one of the written questions. And this is from Just Spiegel, directly to you, Pascal. You named McCarthyite, anti-communism, and ex-communism as being the main reasons for the divorce of Black politics from Marxist political economy after World War II. What about efforts at party building during the interwar period, specifically Trotskyism? In what way, if at all, did the problem begin to develop in this earlier period? Were there problems with socialist political consciousness then that could have encouraged the switch from communism to liberalism, or the persecution of communists before or after World War II?
I think the problem that we have with the rise of McCarthyism actually predates the rise of McCarthyism, and it's in reference to the second question I see there. And I want to concede something. I think that there were mistakes that were made with the Popular Front, United Front effort. That in the face of the rise of fascism, the Communist Party, in the common term, decided that in the United States it would be best to support the liberals and the FDR agenda in order to create a united front in the United States against, the fascism of Nazi Germany and Mussolini. That is where the issues of Blacks in the Communist Party started to take second fiddle, even among socialists. Because we remember when A. Philip Randolph is putting pressure on Roosevelt about the availability of military jobs or hardware development jobs for Black workers, and pushing Roosevelt on accessibility for Black workers in these jobs programs. The Communist Party USA attacked A. Philip Randolph viscerally. Why? Because they were saying, you're causing trouble for Roosevelt. We've got a Popular Front United Front effort here to fight these fascists. We're at war. You can't do that. That's when the real treachery of the communists and what was considered the quote-unquote white left starts to show its face. But it was not because they had never been dedicated truly to the empowerment of the Black poor and working class. It's that the decision to give cover to the Liberal Democratic Party in the face of their fight in World War II against fascism caused the politics of the necessity of Black people to be put on the back burner. And I would argue that was the beginning of the end.
All right, thank you, Pascal. Another question coming from. Well, first, actually, do you two want to respond to either Ashanti or Rutledge? Do you want to respond to any of that before we go on?
I think one of the problems in the 1950s was the increasingly corruption of the Russian Communist Party under Stalin. And unfortunately, many communists in the US either didn't know or didn't care about that corruption. But again, Khrushchev himself in 1957 came out at the UN and talked about the corruption of Stalinism, the brutality, the assassinations of Russian citizens who disagreed with him. So I think a lot of the problems in the coalition that were being made, coalitions being made in the 1950s, were being made either by individuals who were communists who were looking over the corruption of Stalin and didn't care because they thought no matter how bad the Russians were, capitalism was even worse. And I taught a class on Du Bois 2 semesters ago, and my students were very disappointed when they read Du Bois's autobiography and the ways that he cravenly talked about Russia and China. And these students, very smart, they know about the corruption in Russia under Stalin. They know about the oppression in China. And they were basically embarrassed that the Du Bois, whom they had read in Souls of Black Folk, Dusk of Dawn, Dark Water, had so cravenly given in to communism and the corruption of Stalin in Russia and the oppression in China. They knew about these things, and they say, how can a wise Du Bois give in except perhaps his hatred of the West and capitalism made him do it? His hatred of capitalism was worse than his hatred of oppression in Russia and China.
Just to add on to that, you know, becoming an anarchist for me meant that I had to study history of anarchist movements. So I would also like to offer that, you know, when you study the relationship between the Russian Communist Party or the Social Democratic Party, Lenin and all of them folks towards the anarchists, you know, you see that the party formations that begin to attain power become corrupt, and they will do whatever they can to maintain power. They betrayed many of the anarchists, whether it was in the Ukraine or the anarchist workers movements or where the anarchists were in leading positions. They did it. So even back then in the early days of the success of the Russian Revolution, you know, the politicians, Lenin included, Stalin maybe was the extreme example, but we can't exclude Lenin. You know, it's that politics is a real dirty, vicious game. So decade after decade, even leading up to, you know, Khrushchev, there was no change. They would pull out Black folks like Paul Robeson and others and bring them on over and treat them like top-notch, you know, people. But it was all part of a strategy, you know, to like make the Soviet Union look great. But there was folks all along the line, even within the United States, who was not feeling that Communist Party vanguardist, always correct thing. And folks who had the courage to like say no, you know? So for me, I mean, even into the 50s and the 60s, I mean, it's like it was folks who were not having it. When the Black Panther Party identified with Marxist-Leninist politics, the Communist Party was like, what do you know about it? You know, especially with a lumpen base. They're like, what do you know about Marxism-Leninism? But for me, it was like really important for the leadership, B.P. Newton and Eldridge and them, to identify Marxism-Leninism from the Black experience. From the Black experience, it made a hell of a difference. And then you could look at others and see that there could never be no one way to analyze or to look at things through a Marxist-Leninist lens, Marxist-Trotskyist lens, a Marxist-Fanonist lens. You know, we have to be willing to say that we fall into traps sometimes into thinking that because of some momentary success for one movement or a group of leaders, and they are always correct and we should follow that. You know, I appreciate the fact that we was exposed to different revolutionary struggles. Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, all them other ones, you know, like, so here's folks that also using creatively Marxist-Leninist analysis, but it is not the Soviet Union's analysis. What that tells me is that we have to be free thinkers. We have to come from our experience. What would it mean for a First Nations person to take on a Marxist-Leninist perspective? It's going to come from their experience. It's not going to be the same. A Puerto Rican independentista analysis, it's not going to be the same. And we have to be all right with that, you know? it says a lot about where we're at and what we need, some sort of ways that we need to be creative in our thinking. The last thing is that I also feel like some of the leaders of the Zapatista movement came from out of the universities and also inspired by Marxist Leninist things. But somehow they was able to see that what was more important was that their analysis was rooted in the Mexican Mayan experience. So what they did was so fundamentally different from that structured so-called traditional Marxist-Leninist path. We have to be open. We cannot be like, just because it happened here in the Soviet Union, happened here in Cuba, happened here and wherever else. What's important is that you deal with your experience. Your experience is as valid as Lenin's, as valid as Kropotkin's, whatever. And we work from there. We pull in. Be open to other people's input. It's not going to be just one ideological thing.
I agree with that. And may I make a comment on that, please? I think we have to look at, when we look at the whole scope of the communist movement and communist Marxist theory, we see, for example, the uniqueness of Mao's unique take on Soviet Marxism, which of course caused a split in China-Moscow relationship. Right. We also see the unique ways in which Vietnamese communism differed slightly from the communism in Russia and communism in China. So each people has to redefine and interpret. This, of course, was Harold Cruz's main point in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, that Black Americans who became Marxists were trying to fit Marxism into the Russian mold, rather than trying to create a unique Marxism for Black America. And of course, the book by Adolph Reed on Black Marxism sort of leads in that direction. That these are ways, unique ways in which C.L.R. James, for example, maybe Oliver Cox and W.E.B. Du Bois, and even Richard Wright sought to deal with Marxism because each was a Marxist, and how they sought to bring Marxism to the people who were the objects of their attention. And I think that's very important.
I'd like to address a couple of statements, if you don't mind.
Take a right ahead.
For me, this doesn't have to be that complicated. Marxism for me is a simple thing. It is a tool to challenge capitalism. It's not a religion. Doesn't have to be a way of life. It is a tool. Just like you can practice a form of martial arts that is Buddhist in nature, but you don't have to be a Buddhist to know those skills. You use that tool. The problem I have is with even Orthodox Marxists, which I am not one. I use Marxism as a tool to challenge capitalism. With some Orthodox Marxists, is they turn the ideology into almost a quasi-religion. And I don't think we should do that with capitalism or any of these ideologies, because they're not divinely inspired. Mm-hmm. They're man-made, created philosophies on how to view and deal with the world. I use Marxism as a tool to challenge capitalism because I know that capitalism is rooted and originated in primitive accumulation, which meant slaughtering Native Americans and enslaving Blacks. And I defy anyone to find a Black country where the majority of Black people are actually thriving under capitalism. You won't find one. Or you can say that about Latino people in the global South as well, or in the global South in general.
Well, back to your question, though, I don't see very many countries that are really thriving under communism, except perhaps China being the main one. I don't see very many other countries.
But the thing is, though, I don't disagree with that. But the thing is, though, no one is putting any oppositional pressure on any kind of Marxist experiment from a Western capitalist world is immeasurable compared to the lack of any kind of pressure put on the capitalist hierarchy in the world today. Because the whole timing of Marx is responding to what? Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which is a reification, which we've recently learned, came from Hegel's experience witnessing the Haitian Revolution. As a Haitian, I can tell you this. Reifying liberal democracy as the end of history to protect the hierarchies of civilizations and peoples. Marx's project, by the way, the only major Western philosophy that advocated for the liberations of Blacks from slavery, that's Marxism, as a fact, tries to universalize history to challenge the Hegelian hierarchies of history that maintains the oppressions by saying history is rooted in a material combat between phenomenon and realities over time and experience. So for me, as a person who is Black and understands the nature of capitalist expression, using Marx as a tool is a logical thing. But I would never say that Marx had the ultimate perfect idea of a political project in terms of how to form a nation state. I mean, if you read Vladimir Lenin's Marxism and the Nation State, it's an interesting book, but that doesn't mean you're going to just necessarily follow those directions. You've got to take the seeds of what the theory and the philosophy gives you and be creative to adjust to the reality you're in to make the most humane economic paradigm, divorced from capitalism or all the other exploitative economic phenomena that exist within it, for as many human beings as possible. And for me, Marxism is the main tool in trying to do that. That is all.
Yeah. I do think that Marxism has to deal with several things that it has not addressed in Marxism in many countries. That is, the rights of the individual has to be addressed forthrightly. The right of the freedom to assemble, the right of the freedom of press, because in most Marxist-controlled countries, there's only one political party, basically, and mainly, okay? Two, there is very little freedom of the press. There's usually the authorized national press, and there is no freedom of the press. And I think those are fundamental questions that people ask for Marxist direct control countries that are legitimate questions.
Don't you think that's the consequence of constantly always being attacked and undermined from Western imperial powers?
Pardon me?
It's a consequence of these Marxist projects in nation state form having fear of attack and being undermined by Western imperialist and colonial powers.
Oh, does Russia still think that?
No, Russia's not. Russia's a capitalist country now.
Does China still think that?
I think China still does, but I'm not trying to say that to justify it. What I'm saying is that, and I'm not saying I don't agree with that form of government at all. What I'm saying is that in the reality of geostrategic politics, when you have hegemons challenging counter hegemons, Cuba being a country that's 90 miles away from the United States, being put on the longest economic embargo in U.S. history as a country, and still surviving under a Marxian economic model and producing some of the best doctors in the Western world, to me is a point of pride, not a point of derision.
Could we? I don't want to interrupt, but I think I'd like to hear from the audience again, if that's okay with everybody. If we go to another question, just so we have a lot here. So I'd like to go to Anthony's question. How do the panelists consider the election of Barack Obama and the way his election impacted the millennials who were reconsidering the left beginning in the Iraq anti-war movement? Many at the time talked about him as a figure marking an exhaustion with traditional Black politics, for example, with his backing away from Jeremiah Wright. But his presidency was also the origins of BLM. How do you think the millennial generation understood Obama, and was this understanding adequate?
I think that I have to address that because I've written on this subject several times.
Feel free, yeah.
I think Obama was a corporate ruling class manufactured Trojan horse. That probably was one of the most cruel political tricks that the American ruling class manufactured in terms of Black political history. All right, Obama was a Citibank created. His whole first term cabinet was chosen a Citibank executive, as Wiki shows us. He was an acolyte of the most nefarious Secretary of Treasury in American history, Robert Rubin, early on before he became president. He was basically chosen by the banks to give cover to their bailout after the subprime mortgage crisis and keep playing ideological charade with America as he created a political project that transferred more wealth upward than any time since the Gilded Age. Because people were enamored with the symbolic value of his charade of a first Black presidency as a liberatory project, they were deluded and betrayed by their own rather kind of naive expectations.
I agree.
Let me just jump in because here's my thing from an anti-authoritarian perspective, as an anarchist perspective. Why would we think that anybody that comes into presidential office is going to be our savior? Why do we think anybody in authority, political authority, is going to be our savior? Therefore, the anarchist position is you got to get rid of authoritarian figures. You got to be able to move beyond these authoritarian figures. But like my brother just said, like where they get us is that he's going to come across as the first. The media and all the powerful forces is going to make him palatable to us, you know, even though he's not even really from the Black experience here in the United States. It's different. I think that we have to stay focused on what brings power to the people. If we can kind of get people into that type of thinking, then they won't buy into Barack Obama, Joseph Biden, Kamala Harris, and all them other ones. Stay focused. There's an empire that got us here. Individuals within the empire that become political figures, that really is not important, in a sense. So, you know, why get hung up on Barack? Those of us who know, are Marxists, you know, even we know that this guy is not going to do anything for our people. And Biden might even outshine him on that. But what brings down the empire? George Jackson, his thing was, we have to accept the eventuality of bringing this empire to its knees. To its knees. Part of the problem is that we all get into this exceptionalism. I'm not talking about the panelists. I'm talking about, you know, the masses of people out there. They still think of the United States as this exceptionalist reality that, oh no, we can do this through the vote. We can do this through moral reasoning. Even Martin Luther King, moral reasoning. With an empire that is built on bodies of death. Empires. Me and my wife sometimes, you know, at night we watch these series on television, Netflix. One we had just finished watching was House of Cards. And House of Cards just shows how much corruption, normal corruption in a capitalist empire exists. They don't do stuff above ground and through honesty. It's through back dealings, golf courses and other places. They make decisions that keeps the empire going. But when we buy into this, you know, like Barack Obama stuff, and was he, you know, what was that phenomenon? Sometimes we lose sight. What's happening on the ground? What are people doing on the ground? Are they building? Are they meeting each other? Are there community gardens going? Are there liberation schools going? Are people trying to figure out how to create safe communities? It's real, and for that, it doesn't matter whether you're Marxist, anarchist, socialist, Black nationalist. Make your work effective. Because for me, the most important thing always is face to face. When we went into them communities as Panthers, we went in fresh, not knowing what was going to happen. But my God, when people started seeing that you were developing the consistency and you're feeding people and your politics are like constantly exposing the system, they're like, I'm gonna take a chance and get to know these people. And if I get to know them, maybe I'll work with them.
Yeah. I do think that we are an exceptional country, but we are a flawed exceptional country. And most countries are flawed. We're not perfect, but there is no other country I can point to that is perfect. And I think the flawed inconsistency shows up when the nation elects a Black president, while many people are saying that this country is a forever enduring racist country. You look at these inconsistencies between electing the first Black president and some of the data which illustrates that we are still embroiled in racial issues and racial thought. So we are an exceptional country on many levels. We can't deny that. We are exceptional in many ways, but we are a flawed. And I love this country, but I'm very critical of this country. But I try to tell the truth. And the truth is that we have been an exceptional country trying to grapple with, I don't think any other country tries to grapple with racism and recognizes it on some level that we have. We're not perfect. We haven't resolved it, but I don't think any country has resolved its racial, ethnic, linguistic, cultural problems. And these problems, as I tell my class, these problems exist in almost every country in the world that I can point to, whether it's Arab, whether it's Islamic, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Christian, whether it's Buddhist. Every country will, when you look at the internal workings, they have problems. So that I think we are trying to grapple with a problem that we have created in 1619, that we went through a dramatic civil war to solve. And after the Civil War and the Reconstruction, we grapple with Jim Crowism and segregation and second-class citizen. And I think it's been the merit of even those reformist Blacks who formed the NAACP and other groups, that they have tried to grapple as best they could, and they weren't radicals. So we have to sometimes appreciate the reformist, because the reformers will move us an inch along the way, whereas we want the radicals to move us 10 paces. But sometimes we have to appreciate the reformers who move us an inch, because that keeps us moving towards a goal. So I think each of us will have some ambivalence about how fast and how far we want to go. I've had these ambivalences all of my life. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up with it, okay? I grew up with it as a very religious young man. And I went through my Marxist-Leninism, even Maoist days. And I appreciate the insights that I've gained under Marx and Lenin and Mao. But I try to direct those insights to what I can do for Black people and for the larger American society, because I am, above all, an American citizen. I served in the Army. I have kids and grandkids who live here, and therefore I care about their future. So the fight will be an ongoing fight for me. And I'm 82 years old and still teaching and still working, and I hope still fighting. The battle never stops. So we can't become discouraged. And my point is that what's the best model for Black America and the nation? And it can't be forced. It can't be precipitous. What is the best model? How do you catch people where they are and attempt to move them, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, along the path of social change? Radical change if possible, but reformist change if not possible. The fact that you're moving is important. And that's been my task as an individual and as a professor.
So next question is toward Professor Dennis here. Dennis mentioned white socialists directing the ship. This raises the question of leadership. Is there a difference between being a Black leader of Black politics and a Black leader of socialist politics? What is the relationship between being for an ethnic identity and leading a movement for socialism?
Yeah, these two movements have been parallel movements to a great extent. The Black Power movement, and we look at that from the 1960s when Stokely Carmichael in Alabama talked about Black Power, and we look at the SCLC and the NAACP, which was more traditional Black politics, but SNCC later moved to more radical Black politics. We saw the clear distinction between the Black Power movement, that is Blacks going alone, trying to create and construct the institutions in a Black community. And out of that Black Power movement came the richness of Black theater, the attempt for Black economics, Black urban developments, and a host of other things which were designed to capture a Black community that had rejected, to some extent, whites, but had been rejected by whites. Radical Black politics didn't take that route, because radical Black politics went into the avenue of socialism and communism, and therefore adopted Marx and Lenin and Mao and Castro and Ho Chi Minh as their models. And as I said before, these models were foreign to Black people, very foreign to them. And I think we have seen that the Black Power movement stalled and died to some extent, but the remnants are still there. We still have the remnants of Black politics and what have you, but the Black radical movement, which included the Marxist movement, has not made that many headway because they have not directed their attention towards those things in the Black community that Blacks maybe want in a different way, and that doesn't include necessarily knowledge of Marx and Lenin and Mao. So we found, and I'm sure there's some disagreements here, that the two movements went in different directions. The Black Power movement as a separatist movement, beginning with the Nation of Islam, and the Black radical movement, which sought white alliances and white coalitions, mainly radical alliances and radical coalitions, but neither took hold to a great extent for too long. Neither lasted too long, because the Black Power movement became a separatist movement, and the Black radical movement became infused with the white radical communist socialist movement, and therefore was less appealing to Blacks, So it amounted to two different movements, and both having less appeal to Blacks. Because as much as we can criticize the NAACP and its ineffectiveness, more Blacks were drawn to that, and still do. We can criticize it, and I do, and I'm a life member of the NAACP, okay? But what I'm saying is that those advocating Black power and those advocating Black radical movements did not do their job. Maybe they didn't know how to do it, but they didn't do it enough to attract the masses of Blacks in Black communities, because Blacks have followed basically neither. Many followed the Black Power movement because it did some things. It created things for them: theaters, movements, co-ops, Blacks perhaps can't see what the Black radical movement is doing, except its appearance is not there.
Pascal, did you want to respond?
Yes,
I'd
I
like to
wanted to
respond.
hear my
I have to
brother.
disagree several times. So number one, I don't know too many times of the NAACP having COINTELPRO put any of its leaders in lifetime political prisonership for integrating schools and buses. First of all, the reason why the NAACP is so popular in the Black community is because the NAACP works at the behest of the ruling class and capital, and it works at the patronage of those who enslave Black people. So it's never been a threat to the ruling class, and that's why it's so popular, because the Negroes who control those organizations control the ideological infrastructure of the Black community. They have the HBCUs on lock, they got the Black churches on lock, they've got the membership organizations on lock. So when they have the ideological superstructure of Black communities on lock, and they can pacify Black America with a politics that basically concedes everything to the agenda of the ruling class. There's nothing mystical about those Negroes. They're feeding Black people pablum, and they always have been. While the Black radicals of any form, whether they have been communists, whether it was the Colored Farmers Alliance, whether it have been the Black Panther Party, whether it have been the Black Socialists, have always been crushed by the ruling class in this country and ground to dust for their attempts to challenge capitalism and its ability to function in this state. And I would also argue that even though I'm not a fetishist of the Black Power movement, I completely disagree with you with the manifestation of you saying that they were obsessed with Marxism and Leninism and offered nothing to Black people. Why do we think that the Black Panther Party were wearing afros? Why did they have a third worldist Africanist worldview? They integrated their African consciousness into their aesthetics and into their actual ability to manifest Marxism and Leninism in a way that they felt that was beneficial to Black people by embracing things like Black is beautiful. I'm not saying that that's personally good politics, but to argue that they're manifesting Marxist Leninism as some kind of European phenomenon that was divorced from Black people, and that's why they didn't work, was absolutely wrong. Because I can tell you right now, after 1971, every Negro in this country had an afro. Why? Because the cultural appeal of what these movements were actually promoting to Black people caught on. The political message caught on as well, because you know what? Between 1967 and 1971, what were Black people doing? Burning cities down all over the country. They weren't going to the NAACP. They weren't going to the National Urban League. They were burning over 300 cities down to rubble. So the notion that these radical movements had nothing to offer Black folk, I think, is a canard.
But don't forget, the NAACP began as a radical movement. Don't forget, Du Bois was one of the originators of the NAACP.
That was not his radical period, though. That was not his radical period.
But what they were doing at the time, though, was radical, was considered radical to ask for integration, to fight for integration, to fight for justice for Blacks in prison, to fight for better education. These things were radical in 1910. Don't forget.
Was Du Bois radical compared to Hubert? Was Du Bois radical compared to Hubert Harrison?
Compared to whom?
Hubert Harrison.
I'm not familiar with Hubert. I'm sorry, Hubert Harrison.
Hubert Harrison, the Black socialist of the early 1900s.
Okay, I've heard. Yeah. But again, we're looking at Du Bois trying to construct a program of Blacks who were who was under duress.
He was creating a program of racial uplift. Be like us, Black people, go to college and wear nice suits and ties, and you'll be liberated.
But at a point, though, that's important. At a certain point in the history of a people, so you're trying to suggest that Blacks should have been as radical then as they were or should have been in 1960. We're looking at the transition of a people.
Ashanti, did you have something to say?
But why not? Why not be as radical? Remember, there was groups back in the 20s.
The African Blood Brotherhood. Precursors to the Black Panther Party.
Right on. And the thing is, Brother Dennis, that I think even during the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, I know I mean all this reading I've done, I'm not going to pinpoint, but I think some members of the what's the group again, brother?
Black Brotherhood.
I think they were involved in trying to defend the Black community back then in the 20s. So, but I think the thing that we have to grapple with here is that the NAACP, regardless of how they started off, they changed over time. And usually it's because the system figures out a way to co-opt them. Today, they got all kind of corporate, and for decades, they've had all kind of corporate sponsorship. If you got it, you can't be trusted to having the interests of Black people in your hands. And I say that even though there's times in the Black Panther Party's history where there was a need for lawyers, that the Black Panthers didn't reach out to the NAACP, and the NAACP didn't reach out to the Black Panthers and say, we can provide you with this and that. But there has to be those who recognize that there's a need for total transformation of this empire, which for me is George Jackson. We got to bring this empire to its knees. The thought that Black people can put a stop to this empire, and not excluding First Nations, not excluding Chicanos, not excluding all these other people who have been, taken over and miserized by this system.
The question I have, the question for me is, where will the position of Black people be when we bring this empire to its knees? We're assuming that Blacks are going to be treated fairly in a bringing down to its knees. If many of us believe that racism is pervasive in this country, why do we believe when the empire is down that we'll be treated as equals? Why? What makes us think that?
Nothing says that we want to be treated as equals. There's some folks I want to bring up. James and Grace Lee Boggs as Marxists, coming from out of the Trotskyist tradition. But even back then in the 70s, in their writings, they pointed out that Black people were being concentrated in the urban centers, which made them a political force if they could learn how to utilize that. They could shut down the urban centers and technically shut down this empire. And that may not be the same thing today, because now we've been dispersed in other ways and whatnot, and other things, the drug war that's destroying us, and then that black political class that Brother Robert talks about is going on. So we got a lot of things working against us, but we cannot lose sight of this. We cannot be free as long as the empire breathes. We cannot be free as long as it breathes. I don't even think Black Lives Matter got that today, because I was first so enthusiastic I wanted to cry about Black Lives Matter, and you watch how they're incorporated into the system, and when people start fighting back outside of what they're putting out, they're pretty much siding with the system. Oh, the cop got shot here, cop got shot there. Oh, I can't back that, or the sources of, people talk about the sources of their money. I ain't getting into all of that. I appreciate what these young people are doing, but there's a lot in Black Lives Matter who want to bring this empire to its knees. And we, from our backgrounds, have to figure out how to help them. We may not have that answer we got from the traditional stuff may not be the answer. We got to trust that they may know.
One second. There's a question toward Ashanti that might continue this conversation, but I want to get this question out there. Ashanti said Black Power was very formative for him as a young leftist. He mentioned Stokely Carmichael and others. How do the panelists see the old historical debate between Black nationalism and radical integrationism? Is it still a debate today?
I think we're beyond that debate. I don't like that debate. I think it's a narrow casting of Black political history. If you read Preston Smith's book, I have it here, Racial Democracy in the Black Metropolis by Preston H. Smith II, he uses a different framework. He uses what he calls racial democracy, which is basically race-specific policy, politics, and social democracy, which is policy rooted in class politics that is beneficial to everyone in a particular class. And what he finds is that whenever Black people ask for racial democracy, whether they were Black nationalists or integrationists. What always happens is when that policy comes, it always improves the condition of the Black elite, whether they're college educated, university trained elite, or Black nationalist leadership cadre. And it always ends up becoming a situation where the Black poor and working class get the gristle and the crumbs, and the Black elite get the fat back in the biscuits. And that's always been the case when racial democracy has been chosen. When social democracy has been chosen, the Black poor and working class generally do better, but Black elites, whether they be Booker T. Washington or others like him, try to sabotage those cross-racial alliances because they realize that their utility as a ventriloquist for the suffering of the Black masses is neutralized, and they try to kneecap that politics. I'm a recovering Black nationalist. I do not support Black nationalism at all anymore. I was a Black nationalist at one time. Why? Because Black nationalism facilitates the politics of containment. That's what it does.
I do believe the history of every revolution is the history of class hegemony at the top. Every communist government has had a class system at the top. Those who belong to the Bolshevik Party, whether it's Russia, whether it's in China. And now we know, looking at the history of all the Eastern European countries, which have rejected communism and Russia and moved towards Russian, American, and Western capitalism, once we look at their records, we found an unequalness in the population. They spoke about the class system as being open. The records show that members of the elite communist class had the best advantages. They lived in the best homes. They sent their children to the best universities. They could travel abroad. So every class system is an unequal system. In a way, to think that that's not so is living in a different universe, because it will happen. It's going to happen. If we think that there's going to be all of a sudden no racism in America when the American whale falls, I don't think we're being very realistic. If we believe now that racism is a pervasive feature of American society, how is then that racism going to be demolished when the American enterprise falls? And that's the question I've asked my classes. I mean, what's going to cause this racism to diminish or to be abolished when the empire falls?
I have a question I have to ask Professor Dennis. Would you care if a white person was racist against you if his racism had no effect on your quality of life, material condition, or your ideological self-worldview?
No, do I care? No, I don't care.
Then if you don't care, then why not create an economic reality where he doesn't have the power to make you care?
Or if you don't care, let the Black community move towards positions of political power where they're not only able to defend their communities, but they can control the institutions of their community. Even if that means being direct opposition to the interests of empire. Even if it means like we're in a Palestinian situation where we got to deal with these Zionists who have taken over our land and have placed us in a massive prison.
The material reality, the only reason why racism is a factor is because the material realities of capitalism accumulate over time to give it an operational phenomenon that people today call white supremacy. Without the material reality of primitive accumulation and building of empires, whites believing they're superior would mean nothing to the Black and brown world. It is the material accumulation of wealth, resource, power, and weapons that makes this phenomenon called "quote unquote" white supremacy. And as a Haitian American, I hate even saying the word because there's nothing superior about these people in my eyes. But the fact of the matter is that there's nothing mystical or ontological about the phenomenon. It's based on materialism.
So I will go to, unless anyone wants to respond, I have another question we could go to, if that's all right. This is from Will Stratford. Pascal noted how racism divides the working class, but it seems today that it is more so the left's obsession with race that does this. I was amazed by a recent interview I heard with Margaret Kimberly, a regular columnist for the Black Agenda Report on Doug Lane's Zero Squared podcast, where she insisted that the inherent interest of white workers is in keeping Black workers below them, and that white workers would never let Blacks earn as much money as them. Does this renunciation of the working class, whose interest is understood along racial lines rather than material social relations, not also contribute to the division of the working class today? How so exactly?
Well, I mean, Margaret Kimberly is a friend, comrade, and mentor. I would disagree with her on that notion based on the history alone. If you read the wonderful book, The Cry Was Unity by Mark Solomon, African Americans and Communists, 1916 to 1936, not only were the white workers arguing for the economic fair pay of Blacks equal to them, they asked for a special dispensation to compensate Blacks for past generational exploitation in their pay structure. This is actually documented in the book. So this notion that the white working class is always or endemic or perennially will be unwilling to work on equal footing with Blacks is ahistorical. The question is, does the ideological superstructure of America today make it more difficult to achieve that parity? I would argue that it does in the age of a rising fascist movement like Trumpism, but that doesn't mean it's some kind of genetic impossibility.
There may be singular cases to support what Pascal is saying, but the history of Black-white labor relations has been a very negative one. Where the white working classes, and Du Bois talks about this in Black Reconstruction, that the planter class was able to get the white poor farmers to side with them, whereas many Blacks during the Reconstruction sought to draw the poor white farmers and poor white laborers into a coalition of Blacks. It failed, for the same reason that the progressive movement failed at the end of the 19th century and failed into the early 20th century, because the white laborers were unwilling to form a coalition massively with Blacks. Now, there may be isolated cases that, as Pascal just mentioned, which is true, and I agree with that. But I'm saying, looking at the massive labor movement, we don't see this optimism that Pascal is talking about. We see rather a very negative relationship between Black and white laborers, and the unwillingness of white laborers to even have Blacks join labor unions at one point.
I would never deny that history. There's truth to that history, but we have plenty of history showing otherwise as well. My point is that no one is arguing it's going to be a kumbaya process. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a tough fight. And what you have to be able to be willing to do is take it to the white folk who are trying to deny you what you deserve, period. Whether it's intellectually, argumentatively, or physically. So put yourself and get ready. This is not going to be a cakewalk. No one ever promised anyone a rose garden here. But the bottom line is as long as we believe that there's some kind of ontological earth science obstacle to Black people and white people working together to improve their mutual interest, that belies the civil rights movement, that belies the abolitionist movement, because the bottom line was there were white people who were sacrificing their lives to improve the condition of Blacks when there was not much benefit for them to do it. So if we can purge this, if we can pierce this racist charade in the minds of certain segments, and not all, but certain segments of whites and Latinos enough that they, like our comrades at this panel, would be willing to hear the Black perspective on this history, then I think that will be a step in us being able to penetrate this racist charade of stupidity to fight the equalizing oppressive factor, which is the capitalist and imperialist world economy.
I agree with you, and this is why my first comments when I began talking was the fact that the white radical movement has failed. It should have been involved in the white community, particularly in the South, where much of the racism, overt racism existed. I think had the white radical movement directed its energies there, things may have been different. But I think this was the failure earlier of the white radical movement. It did not address itself, nor did it go to the places where they should have been, where they would have been needed, that is, to the white, lower, middle, working class communities. And that's where they failed.
Ashanti, do you want to respond?
No, just, it just made me think of, there's been times in my experience, Black Panther Party, you had folks from the Students for Democratic Society that moved into the Weather Underground. And now not working class, and none of them will say that they're working class, but their intention, from their perspective, was how to aid, how to be allies to folks, First Nations folks and folks of African descent, and the struggle for liberation. And they would, in their documents, whether it was Osawatomie or whatever, they would put out information that was just breaking down the reasons why, some of these false reasons why we couldn't get together. It would show that we could. Osawatomie was named after John Brown, John Brown's efforts, which was a multiracial effort to end slavery. So there was all kind of things, and you still got folks that are doing one particular, and David Gilbert, who is still in prison today after 40 or so years, who was part of the Weather Underground. That whole thing helped us to understand that the multiracial struggle was still very important, and it showed the possibilities of folks from different racial backgrounds could unite around a vision that was about creating a new land here that was now under the empire. And that for me was like really important. And David Gilbert's still in prison in upstate New York, after 40, probably close to 50 years. Can't get no attention.
All right, we'll go to the final question here. To wrap up, and it is, what's the horizon of imagination for change? If the standard of success is making Black lives better, then that is the same as the Democrats and Republicans. Is the goal here a New Deal 2.0, or when you all say socialism, do you mean something more radical?
I mean something more radical, but I wouldn't balk at a New Deal 2.0 either. As long as it included Black people, unlike the first New Deal that was kind of questionable in the ways it dealt with Black folk. But if we could get a New Deal 2.0 that was on terms where Black people were treated fairly and equally in terms of the benefits, I wouldn't turn it down, but I'm also not, that's not going to stop me from fighting for a broader socialist project.
Just to give my part, I don't care whether it's called socialism or whatever. I like liberation, and we can figure it out. That's a Zapatista thing. Zapatista revolution was about the questions being as important as anything else, that we don't have to have all the answers, but we can figure it out as we go. We can ask questions as we go. And collectively, we can figure out where we want to go as we're making them steps. But bottom line is, it must empower people all the way. It must deal with all the intricacies of our history here in this empire. It must not ignore the First Nations people. It must not ignore what happened and continues to happen to people of African descent. It must not ignore that Mexico, Chicanos are still dealing with what happened to the land theft of Mexico. Why are we in Hawaii? Why are we in Alaska? How can we create a world where many worlds exist? That's what moves me.
I think social change will come about when there is honest coalition politics. I believe coalition politics is necessary. At the same time, I believe that the cultural foundation and heritage of each group in the coalition is important. There are unique things to Black America that will help to further the advancement of Black America and the nation. I'm interested in the national improvement. And I think the coalition of Blacks with groups like-minded who have an interest in social change, radical or reformist, who recognize the unique cultural contributions of each group in the coalition. I think that's when we can really honestly sit down and map out where we want to go. And I think that is possible. And we've had inkling of that in the past. I think it can be repeated to some extent, but I think it has been honest dialogue. And the reason why coalition didn't work in the past was that I think whites in such coalitions wanted to be the head driving the body. And as Blacks began to mature politically, Blacks rejected that. But I think an honest coming together, sitting down and planning and strategizing about what the nation wants, but also what each group in the coalition wants. And that's because the needs of Blacks. And beneath that, we can include the Haitians. We can include all the special groups because they have interests too. They have linguistic interests, they have cultural interests, and we have to take advantage of that and recognize that. So I think social change is possible, but has to be done in ways that we didn't try in the past. This has to be a unique, innovative way of applying the social change with recognizing the heritage and cultural understanding of each group. It's kind of a Du Bois's cultural political pluralism, because different political messages will have to be tried in different places. This is places between rural America, for example, and urban America may require different types of institutional structures. But I think this coalition can attend to that, and perhaps in the long term, we may not see it, be successful. And that's what I hope and pray for.
Right on.
Great. Thank you all so much for being a part of this panel. This concludes our panel today. And again, thank you all for coming and speaking. And we will have a post-discussion panel or a post-discussion Zoom meeting here around, if you'd like to join, at around 5:30 Eastern Standard Time. And check YouTube later for this talk. We'll have it up later today. So, all right. Thank you so much.
Send out the link to the YouTube.
Nice to meet you, Pascal and Ashanti. Very good.
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Professor Dennis, pleasure and honor to meet you. Brother Alston, Ashanti, I always love to meet the elders from the days past in the struggle.
Honor as well. Right on.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you so much.
Brother Rutledge, thank you so much.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your moderation panel.
Thank you for the moderation.
Thank you, Seth. Okay. Take care.
Thank you all.
I think this was a very wonderful. This was a wonderful. I just want to say I think this was a wonderful conversation.
Right on.
It was a very important discussion here, and I look forward to seeing the link to the YouTube, and we should share it widely across the racial board.
Right. Yeah. I agree with you.
We'll make sure to send. We'll make sure to send it out to all of you. So
okay, thank you.